Alright, let's start talking about square roots. Now, as far as the definition goes for square roots, if a squared is equal to b, then a is the square root of b. A couple more words that you should know. First one would be a radical. And what we mean by the word radical is the actual square root symbol. That would be referred to as the radical. Now, the number that is underneath the square root, in this case that b, that's called the radicand. Now, how we evaluate a square root or how we evaluate a radical is like this. Since we know that 2 squared is equal to 4, that would mean that the square root of 4 is equal to 2. And we know that 3 squared is equal to 9. That would mean that the square root of 9 is equal to 3. 4 squared is equal to 16. That's going to mean that the square root of 16 is equal to 4. These are what I would refer to as perfect square roots, because when we take the square roots of these numbers, we end up with nice round integers. You should know all of your perfect square roots up to the square root of 100. We already did the square root of 4, the square root of 9, and the square root of 16. But when it comes to the square root of 25, we know that 5 squared is 25. That means that the square root of 25 is going to be 5. We know that 6 squared is 36, so the square root of 36 is 6. Square root of 49 has to be 7 because 7 squared is 49. Square root of 64 is 8, square root of 81 is 9, and the square root of 100 is 10. Like I said, you should have all of these memorized. If you don't have them memorized right now, what you should do is pause the video, take out a piece of paper, and write them down. Keep them for future reference and refer to them often. So, when we want to simplify the square root of 64, we just think what number times itself is 64. We know that 8 squared is 64. That would mean square root of 64 is 8. And the square root of 25, well, 5 squared is 25. So square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 81, what squared is equal to 81? That would be 9. So square root of 81 is 9. And the square root of 36, well, 6 squared is 36, so square root of 36 is 6. Sometimes you might see a radical expression like this, 3 square root of 49. And what we mean by that is that there's this implied multiplication in there, 3 times the square root of 49. To simplify this expression, we're going to calculate that square root first, and the square root of 49 is 7. Once we have that, then we multiply 3 times 7 is 21. So if we have something like negative 5 square root of 100, we think negative 5 times the square root of 100. Square root of 100 is 10. Negative 5 times 10 is negative 50. If you're looking on your calculator, you want to look for symbols that look like just a square root, and it might be the square root or the square root of x. There are other buttons on your calculator that refer to larger indexed roots, and that would be a symbol like x root or the yth root of x. Do not use these symbols when you're trying to find the square root. Instead, just use the ones that are square root of blank or square root of x. I noticed that on the iPhone, their square root button looks like this. Even though you would never actually write square root of x like that, that's how your iPhone refers to the square root. Practice using your calculator. Got one near you? Take it out right now and find the square root of 20 accurate to 2 decimal places. Now, depending on your calculator, you might have to type in 20 and then hit the square root button. Another calculator, it might be that you have to hit the square root button, type in 20, and then hit enter. Whichever way your calculator is, you have to figure that out. The right answer, when you calculate the square root of 20, is 4.4721355. The thing about square roots is that if they're not perfect squares, then they're what we call irrational numbers. The decimal is gonna go on and on forever, and it's never gonna repeat. So read the directions and find out how many of those decimal places you should have to write down. All right. If I ask you to simplify the expression or evaluate the radical accurate to 2 decimal places, I mean after the decimal point there's 2 places. All of this stuff you don't have to write down. So you can say the square root of 20 is 4.47. If you type in the square root of 52 into your calculator, you should get 7.21. Try a harder one too, where you have to add 9 to the square root of 18. Maybe you can type it in just like this, 9 plus the square root of 18. Maybe, especially if you have to type in the 18 before you hit the square root button, you should do this in a different order. What I mean by that is maybe you should rewrite this as the square root of 18 plus 9. That way, you would find the square root of 18, hit enter, then add 9 and hit enter. When it's all said and done, you should end up with an answer of 13.24. Figure out your calculator, make sure that you can get answers like these